In the second paper, we are going to again use the large national collection of census material. But what we are doing here is to analyze and examine for the first time fundamental changes in household and family structure. So what we are investigating here is how people live together, the residential arrangements of families and individuals. I need to say a couple of things in background. Firstly is that this has no maths because it's a quite complex analysis where it, for the very first time, is trying to show the average experience in living arrangements and how they changed over the 19th and early 20th century for England and Wales. So the figures that you see are for England and Wales. The second general point is that what you have to understand is that in this period, the underlying demography of the population is changing, and changing in some instances fairly quickly. So what do I mean by that? Two things. The first is something that we have already encountered in the first lecture. I mentioned in the first lecture life tables, and how life tables actually show the probability of dying. What you have here is one statistic taken from 19th century life tables, what's called EX, which is the expectation. Essentially what this is telling you is how mathematically it's telling you, so this would be E0, this is expectation of life at birth. This is essentially the average age at the top here at which people died. And you can see that it goes up and then it goes down again. So if you take this one here, at age 50, the average number of years that, this is males, the average number of years that males would have to live was about 19 to 20. And you will see that it doesn't change. It very rarely, it doesn't change from the mid-19th century to the the early 20th. What that's telling you is that the mortality of people in later life did not improve in this period. You can see here 45, again, very similar numbers. However, if you look at this end, say at age 1, you'll see that it increases dramatically to 55, from 50 to 55, from 47, slightly less improved. The point is that what this shows you is that this population has quite rapidly improving infant and child mortality, which means that overall longer, but the mortality improvement is only at the early ages. It is not at the latter ages. So mortality is improving for those people essentially under the age of 10. Okay?
это довольно важная сейчас историко-демографического исследования, и, наверное, все поняли, но я, может быть, обобщил то, что было сказано. Значит, мы видим здесь такие пятилетние интервалы в левом колонке. Это интервалы возрастных групп. И вот первая строка показывает, что сам факт, что вы родились в это время, означал, что у вас уже жизни до конца, вот, в интервале 1859, вот, по следующей переписи, следующие 10 лет, вы живете тоже 10 лет, но уже последняя вот перепись в этом интервале 1900-1909. Вот, значит, здесь вы могли уже прожить 48 лет, если вы родились. Но поскольку есть детская смертность, то вот те, кто дожили до 1 года, это вторая строка, они имели среднюю продолжительность жизни 47 лет для тех, кто родились в первую перепись здесь, и они могли прожить 65 лет, если они родились, значит, вот в эту последнюю перепись. И это показывает, что родились в это время, возможность прожить увеличивалась заметно, шансы возрастали. Но как только мы смотрим на категорию 50-летних, им оставалось дожить еще 19 лет и 8 десятых по первой переписи, и примерно столько же мы видим 19, 18, 19. Все следующие, те, кто родились от последующей переписи, им тоже оставалось 19 лет. То есть уровень жизни для вот этих людей не рос за эти полстолетия. Но мы видим, что если человек дожил до 50 лет, у него впереди было почти 20 лет. То есть он мог в среднем дожить. Вот. Те же, кто дожил до 1 года, вот, у них средняя длительность жизни была 55 лет. Вот эти данные получены на сплошных, на базе данных, которая включает все сведения по этим переписям. Мы наблюдаем здесь, да? И на первичном уровне все они были, как и в прошлой работе, введены были в базу данных.
So, the second important point with this is very simple. There is a gender difference. This is males, this is females. And again, you can see that females live longer. It's true of the historical past, and it is true the females in this room will outlive the males. It's a straightforward demographic fact. But what you can see in this period is that the improvement in mortality is differential. Here, there is at birth a differential between males and
женщины. Мы видим, что у них длительность жизни была больше, и мы можем сравнивать соответствующие строчки верхние для мужчин, нижняя таблица для женщин.
Whereas by the end of the period, it becomes a 4-year differential. So mortality is improving for both males and females, but are improving differentially more than males. And that is the standard mortality regime that we have to work with. So, the other thing that is happening is that not only do we have changing mortality with particularly with infants and child, but we also have increasingly over the period, particularly from the 1870s and the early 1880s, 1980s have declining fertility. So women on average are having less children. What we see in England and Wales from the 1870s, 1888 is the onset of what is referred to as the secular decline in fertility. It's secular because it happens across the whole world. It happens in Russia in the 20th century, but it starts in England in the 1870s before any other industrial nation. So we start of the secular decline in fertility. And you have to bear in mind that these things, changing mortality, changing fertility, will have an effect by definition on families. And what we're looking at in this paper is the effect that those things have. So, if we take a very simple measure, which is looking at the mean, i.e. average household size, and we compare the pre-industrial period with the period when we have these new data here, you can see that the mean household size actually very different in 1911 than it is in the second part of the 17th and first part of the 18th century. So it increases and then decreases again. But this mean figure hides a number of things. In particular, you see that there is a change in co-residential servants. Servants were a very important part of the pre-industrial household in England and Wales, and then gradually decline over time. So there is a very rapid change there. And what you can also see is that actually the numbers of people who are related, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, brothers and sisters, residential kin, actually increases and then decreases. And the number of offspring also is higher. This is due to fertility. So there are structural changes happening here, as well as demographic changes. This is a structural change. This is potentially a structural and demographic change. This is a demographic change, as well as potentially a structural change. One of the reasons this is low is not because of fertility, but because these people have left the family home to become servants. So as this decreases, you'd expect that to increase, and that's what you see is happening here. So there is a mixture of structural and demographic change, and the rest of the paper tries to understand the nature of those structural changes. I don't want to talk about this too much, but it's just simply showing that we looked in the previous slide at mean household size, and this is just to illustrate the size of the residential group changes by age. Basically, when you are around about 10, 9, 10, 11, you tend to be in larger households. And this is just simply showing the stage of family development. So basically, this is child rearing, children leaving. This is the early stage post-marriage. This is then children coming in. So these are children living with their parents. This is what you might call the new marital stage, and this is when children have left home. So the point is that over the course of the life cycle, you will see changes in the size of the household. Now you can classify households in various different ways, and this is the standard classification that was developed in Cambridge by one of my previous colleagues, Peter Laslett. It's called the Hammond-Laslett Household Classification.
Это очень известная классификация типов семей, разработанная в знаменитой кембриджской группе по истории семьи и народного населения. Значит, разработанная, когда Кевин был членом этой группы, он состоял в кембриджской этой группе, и она сделала классическую такую схему классификации. Вот мы здесь видим несколько подразделений этих семей, которые связаны с композицией этой семьи. Просто женатая пара без детей, или с детьми, или живущая со своими родителями и так далее. Она стала классической и используется во всех историко-демографических работах.
I'm just wondering whether I have you on here. I'm just going to see if I do, because it will help explain something. Bear with me a minute whilst I just have a quick look. Let me just see.
Вообще это направление, оно отражает изменения, которые произошли в европейской
Don't worry, I will explain it linguistically. These are households with different types of family members. Now, today, most people live in small, what we call nuclear families, i.e. we have a married couple and children, unmarried children. When children marry, family home. Very often this type of family is seen as the product of industrialization. In reality, in England and Wales, we see that type of family. So here we have the largest numbers prior to industrialization. But what we actually see in the 19th century are increased proportion of what we call extended households, i.e. these are households where you have an extension with the presence of another related member of the family, other than the parents and the children. It could be a grandparent, it could be a sibling, it could be a cousin. So these are kin extended households. Now, what I was looking for, to see if I have it here, but I don't, is that just to illustrate how different this is from most of Western Europe, and in particular Europe, you will see here that the proportion of people who are living without extended kin, if we just go down, you can see we will get there. Here we go. So you can see here the proportion of people living with kin is around about a third. This is of individuals. If you looked in Russia, at the same time, what do you think the figure would be? Any takers? If you compared that to Russia from 1851 to 1911, that figure would be about 95–90%.
Big bang.
Russian households in this period are more orientated. But even so, by English standards, these figures are quite high. Curiously, they're higher than the pre-industrial past. So point number one is that the industrialization of the early 19th century did not create nuclear households. If anything, it actually created more people living with kin. It's a reversal of the traditional understanding of industrialization. So that's point number one. If we look at a particular type of residential arrangement, one of the concerns that we have in contemporary Western society, and to a certain extent this is also becoming true in Russia, in 21st century Russia, but one of the concerns that we have in much of late 20th century Western Europe, in particular England and Wales, is the proportion of people who are now living alone. We have seen the proportion, the numbers of people who are living on their own, without a family, without a spouse, without children, increase quite rapidly. And this is seen as a social problem. This is seen as a reflection of society. Loneliness and the dependency that loneliness creates is seen as a modern problem generated in the late 20th century. However, what this shows you is that the proportion of individuals living alone, whilst it didn't change dramatically in the period of the late 20th century, what you actually see is that you have some interesting changes. So living alone, females in the beginning of the period was something that was associated with the higher social classes. So this is actually indicating that, to a certain extent, living alone means that you have to afford to be able to do it. You have to have the resources to live alone. What you actually find is that increasingly it becomes associated not with social class, but by a rural-urban difference. And actually, what that you have is a very important structural shift in the nature of living alone. Even though the overall percentages don't change, there's an important structural shift whereby the early 20th century, living alone is a product of exactly what we were talking about in the earlier paper. It's the residue of migration. These are essentially widowed mothers and fathers, widowed mothers in particular, whose children have all left the agricultural area. So they are now living on their own. So this is a very different type of living alone 60 years earlier. It's a social shift and it's a geographical shift. And it's, again, indicating that the problem of loneliness and living on a loan is not a 20th century phenomenon. It has a historical trajectory that starts in the 19th century.
Okay, just a moment. Because you like the proportion of women who live alone for male. Why? For instance, let's look at the first line, agriculture. At 1911, 4% of females live alone, and
High.
always high, always female proportion of alone is higher for female than for male. Why? How it can happen?
Do you want me to tell you?
My question is, for instance, we have 100 of males and 100 of females. Why the proportion of females is always yes.
Maybe we can blend it with the...
This is because my guess is it is because the length of life of males is shorter than for females. This is why always the пропорция одиноких женщин всегда выше, потому что умирают к 45 годам, это все для 45 лет. Значит, до 45 лет мужчины доживают меньше, чем женщины, и поэтому одиноких женщин больше, чем одиноких мужчин. Ровно, если бы они доживали одинаково, то было бы невозможно представить, что количество женщин одиноких больше, чем количество мужчин одиноких. Это не может быть такого. Если их 45 лет 100 мужчин, значит, сколько одиноких женщин, столько одиноких мужчин. Не знаю. Вот. Все это связано.
It's a straightforward demographic fact, and it's true across all time. The women in this room, if you should marry a man, realistically that man will die before you will.
8 лет разница. In Russia we have 8 years difference in expected life for male and female. 8 years.
And that's why you always see more men. That in itself is not the important part of this because that's a historical constant. What's the matter is that you see a social shift in the nature of that. That's the whole point. One is a migration result, one is an economic result. So let's move on. I'm going to skip over that. Okay. So I said one of the concerns about contemporary and late 20th century and Western European society is loneliness, the extent to which old people in particular, and not exclusively old people, live alone. The other concern that we have about family life, and I don't know whether this is a concern in Russia, but it may well be a concern, is that we talk about portion of lone parent families. What that means are the number of families where there is just one parent, invariably the mother. A mother bringing up children on her own. Okay? Now, in late 20th century Western Europe, and this may be case in Russia too, but I don't know, this is caused, and it's seen as a social problem, a welfare problem, because it creates dependency. This is caused by divorce. A couple get married, they love one another, they have children, they decide that they don't like one another anymore. So invariably the man leaves, and leaves the children with the mother. Not exclusively, but that's the standard pattern. So we see in a divorced society a rise of lone parentage, whether it be with the mother or the father. So we have seen children growing up with just one parent. Okay? That's a phenomenon across the, and it creates a dependency, a social and economic dependency that creates problems, and it's seen as a kind of collapse of family values. So let's explore that historically. Here we have the contemporary world. Let's focus on this side. Very recent. This is England and Wales in 2016. Slightly different data. This is calculated from something called the Labour Force Survey, but let's not worry about that. And here you can see 20 years beforehand. So this is what people are worried about, that they are seeing that the percentage of people who are living, or the percentage of families, is rising over time. And in particular, they are worried about lone mothers with dependent and non-dependent children. Dependent basically means younger children, young children. It's rising, but it isn't actually rising that rapidly. It's seen as a big social problem that we now have a lot of children living in single-parent families. However, if we look at the 19th and early 20th century, you will see that actually this is not a new phenomenon at all. That actually, we actually have higher proportions of singleness, and actually decline over time. Actually, what we're seeing is a decline, and actually that decline goes up to the 1950s and then starts to rise again. So again, what this modern day concern about does not take into account the historical past, because the low point is in the 1950s. So they're seeing this rise from the 50s, but actually it's been declining from the mid-19th century. Now, of course, there's a big difference here. This is created by divorce. Divorce breaks the family. This is created by mortality. Mortality kills your spouse here. Separates the spouses here. And the reason that this improves is going back to the beginning where I showed you the life table and the improving mortality. This is showing that adult mortality is gradually improving, so marriages are lasting longer. There is a certain irony. We often talk about family values in Western Europe and how divorce is undermining the traditional family. Families don't stay together. Realistically, what is happening is something slightly different than that. The average age of marriage, the duration, the average length of time that a married couple would stay together is ironically the same now, pretty much as it was in the mid-19th century. The difference is that now, if you want to get rid of your husband or your wife, you divorce them. In the 19th, if you wanted to get rid of your husband or the wife, you just had to wait for them to die. Mortality has done for families in the 19th century exactly what divorce has done for families in the late 20th century. So children living with just one parent is not a new phenomenon. That's the point that this is making. I'm just going to go back and remind you of something. When we looked at the household structure before, one of the things I'm interested in is the proportion of people living with relatives here, the proportion of households that were extended. And you'll see that it declines slightly over time. It goes down, up a little bit, and down. It's roughly relatively constant around the 13 or 14% mark. So you might argue from that the situation vis-a-vis kin extended households does not change. However, what those hide is this. Those are mean figures. And the problem of looking at any mean figure is to understand the variance below and above that mean. Now, do you all know standard deviation? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So, everybody stand up. Stand up. Everybody stand up. Now, you will notice that we're not all the same height. Some people are taller than others, are shorter than others. Okay? If we all stood in a line with the shortest person and the tallest person, you would have extreme values. So, you, I think, are the tallest. No, maybe you are the tallest. And
Максим сам просто.
yeah, okay. Yeah, your hand in the air. I think maybe you are the shortest. Sorry. So these are our extreme values. But most people, a good maybe 70, 60% are similar height in the value. That is a classic standard deviation. You have a normal distribution. So you can see the point is that you are normal. Okay? You have a normal distribution curve where you have small numbers of extreme values. Okay? What this graph is showing you is the number of places, don't worry about the terminology here, but the parishes, the number of places experience households of different types. And what you can see is that the shape of the curve fundamentally changes. So, you have a much more normal distribution curve at the end, and actually a wide distribution curve, i.e. a lot of people, particularly here, away from the mean. i.e. the standard, if you measured the standard deviation reduces significantly over time. The mean value doesn't change very much, but the distribution around the mean changes quite significantly.
Важный момент, я комментирую. Вот то, что мы сейчас видим, это этих приходов по проценту расширенных семей, которые живут с родственниками. И пунктиром показано середина 19 века распределение, а сплошная линия это 1911 год. И вот мы видим, что пик приходится примерно на одну и ту же цифру, где-то процентов 14. То есть 14 наиболее типичная расширенных семей это 14%. Из всех семей 14% это живут с родственниками, расширенный состав семьи. Вот, и этот пик остался и за полвека с лишним он не ушел. А вот что изменилось, это пласты уменьшились со временем. То есть для тех, у кого, например, было 30% расширенных семей в середине 19 века, к концу уже упала. Мы видим, сплошная линия идет ниже. То есть доля семей, у которых много, доля приходов, у которых много расширенных семей, она уменьшается. Вот. И за счет этого график, это распределение стягивается. Меньше становится расширенных семей, больше становится похожих на среднее, на вот эти. То есть этот график показывает, как распределение расширенных семей меняется за эти 60 лет.
So what these new data show regarding to households with kin in, this particular type of extended household, is that although the mean figure doesn't change very much, and you saw that in the previous table, what the hides, what the aggregate data hide, is that you have a fundamental and quite significant shift in distribution. So essentially this is what, looking at it another way, the geography of kinship changes dramatically over this period. And that's something which has never been measured before. And you can see some of that here. This is looking at, again, those households with kin, extended households. Don't worry about what a registration subdistrict is. It's basically an area unit, a spatial unit. But this is looking at types of place. Okay? You can see, well, first of all, textile is very unusual. You can see textile is by far the highest at the beginning of the period and falls over time. And that's important because a lot of what has been written about the family in the 19th century in England and Wales has been based on textile towns. If you look at Michael Anderson's class on family structure in 19th century England, it's based on Preston. It's a textile town. What he fails to point out is it's very unusual. That's the first point. What you can also see is that, so the geography is changing. Textile towns are going, but mining increasing. So the point is that, again, there are structural effects going on. And in particular, you can see that there's a rise in this kind of suburban, semi-professional type of area. Now, if we just move on and look at the household head, so here we're not looking at the, but we're looking at the social class of the household that we're talking about. Here you can see textile declining quite quickly. Textile is out on its own. Here you can see mining going in the other direction, going up. But look at what's happening with professionals. Middle class are actually declining and declining. Here, again, decline and decline quite rapidly. These might look like small numbers, but that's actually quite a big drop. So, essentially, again, you have a structural change that's going on vis-a-vis kinship. In the mid-19th century, it is more the wealthier, more middle class, more bourgeois who are living with kin. Perhaps with the exception of textile workers, which is a very special group. But then it changes, where living with kin is not associated with the economic and social elite. It's actually associated with the working classes. So living with kin changes complexity. It moves from being middle class to more working class. And one of the things that I argue is that this is related to a fundamental switch within society, where living with kin at the beginning is more about a reciprocal arrangement, is not supporting, to a certain extent, maybe your elderly parents in the bourgeoisie or in the middle classes. And over time, it becomes much more of a subsistence thing. So the economics of living with kin changes. It changes from something that's more associated with the middle class, where it's more about dependency in the working class than it was previously in the mid-19th century with the middle class. So you have a fundamental switch in living arrangements which are based on class happening over the course of the 19th century. That extends that point, but I'm going to leave that out. I'm going to possibly leave that one out as well. I'm now going to try and work towards a conclusion. So we have talked about issues that are a concern in contemporary Britain. Living alone, single-parent families. And we have shown that these have an historical dimension to them. They aren't necessarily as new as we think they are. What I want to come on the final point here is another fundamental switch that people have failed to look at over the course of the 19th century. This is looking at basically children. So these are people who are aged less than 16. All right? And what this shows you is this is the proportion of children who live with parents, girls and boys, in 1851. So this is living with both parents, and you can see that from about the age of 11, 12, it dramatically starts to decline. And this is the converse of that. This is the people living with neither parent. It rapidly starts to increase. Part of that is mortality. This is a mortality effect. But this is primarily, essentially, children beginning to leave the parental home. What you have in mid-19th century Britain, and it's true of earlier periods as well, is that people leave the parental home. They leave to work and live elsewhere. So leaving home is a process that starts fairly early on in life. Now, if we move forward in time, let's move to this year. This is the beginning of the... And you can see that the shape of this curve, although for girls, it's still happening, but it's also happening later. Do you remember this curve changed for the earlier one up here? Now it's happening later, and it is not so rapid. And for the males, that drop, which was happening here, has virtually stopped. Something dramatic going on in the English household. Basically, children are staying with their parents longer. They are leaving home later. And we can calculate what I call the singular mean age of leaving home. sorry, we can also see this here. If you look at it the other way around, this is showing you the same thing, but in a different way. This is the proportion of males and females, males, living without either parent. This is
Каждая линия показывает одну из переписей. Самая левая ранняя перепись, самая поздняя 1911.
so this is a mortality effect. That's just dying when you're young. But you can see here that then this is the beginning of the process of leaving home. And this is clearly happening before marriage. Now what's important here is not, you don't need to know what the individual lines are. What matters is from left to right. It means that over the 50 to 60 years, people are gradually leaving home later and later. And it happens more so in the case of males than it does for females. What matters is that gradually this moves further and further to the right. If you looked at this today, if I put a curve on this today, I have a curve that goes somewhere up here. So gradually moved to the right. Now,
One minute. Здесь мы видим, какова доля молодых людей, которые живут без родителей, или хотя бы без одного из родителей. И, скажем, в 1911 году в возрасте там, 21 год это было около 40% молодых людей, которые живут уже без родителей. А в возрасте там, где-то уже 90%. И мы видим, как меняется, как растет доля людей, которые живут без родителей, по мере движения там, 30 лет.
so that's looking at this in a slightly different way. This is using what I calculate as the singular mean age of leaving the parental home. Let's not worry about how that's calculated too much. It's a straightforward. It's a mathematical calculation that you can do on census-based information. And this is my point. You can see the average age of leaving home gets older progressively, particularly for males. Males is always later than females, but it increases for both. And in particular, the start of the process, what I call the takeoff age, again for males becomes much more delayed than females. Now why is that important? Because if you compare the age of leaving home with the age of marriage, essentially that is a number of years. You are experiencing it now. This is part of the development of young people. There is a period in a lot of young people's lives where they spend a number of years away from their parents before forming their own household, before getting married and having children of their own. And what this is that, again, these look like small numbers, but actually this has a huge social and economic impact. That the average length of that period spent between leaving the parental home and marriage declines over the period, and particularly in the last 20 or so years of the period. That essentially is the fundamental switch that we now associate with the modern family. And what we can see is that that is something that started to happen at the very beginning of the 20th century. So already families are beginning to look much more with this switch. And lastly, to look at it a slightly different way, this is all very much showing, making the same point, with a fundamental point that people have not explored before, because you can only see it with big data. Essentially, what I am trying to show you is that these curves get closer together. Essentially, the distance between these curves is the transition between childhood, i.e. living with your parent, and being having children of your own. And the gap between those things grows over time and begins to narrow quite rapidly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Now that's important, not just because that's the rise essentially of the modern family, but it also means that that has huge impact on social and economic life. Because it basically means that there are a lot fewer young, adolescent, teenage, early 20-year-old single people in towns, in cities, in countryside. That has a dramatic effect on employment. It has a dramatic, what you might call adolescent culture. So, and it's an interesting process because in the early 21st century, what we are seeing for the very first time is a reversal of this, where actually, rather than narrowing, this gap is now getting bigger again, where young people are spending more time living in the parental home, are getting married later. So we're actually seeing a reversal situation. It's gone down, it went up, and it's gone down again. The point again is that what we have seen in the late 20th century and the 21st century is not in itself a modern phenomenon. It's a process that has much longer historical longevity to it. And therefore, the conclusion is there's very little that's really new about the modern family. What the new data here show us is that most of the things that we associate with the modern family started in the mid-19th century onwards. And so this is a result not of rapid change, but continuous change over time.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will make some comments after the question. Значит, мы с вами увидели, вот сколько всего можно получить, если мы ввели в базу данных все сведения из переписи, которые содержат сведения о семье. В данном случае в центре был вопрос о семье, ее композиции, типах семьи, о том, как эти 60 лет менялась, скажем, доля семей, которые живут в расширенном составе, не в одном поколении, в двух поколениях, а больше, с родственниками. Мы видели, как меняется за эти годы одиноких семей. Мы видели, как структурно меняются эти характеристики, то есть в разрезе через сектора занятости, от сельского хозяйства до белых воротничков. Мы видели, как менялась характеристика, когда молодые люди уходят от своих родителей, как менялся за эти 60 лет средний возраст настоятельной жизни от родителей. Мы видели, как изменяется, уменьшается интервал времени между уходом из родительской семьи и формированием, созданием своей семьи, появлением своих детей. Вот, как это ситуация в Англии, он, конечно, возможно на базе вот этого созданного массива больших данных, когда речь идет о том, что здесь 100 миллионов записей в базе. Но к этой базе можно обращаться вот с запросами, которые вы на втором курсе изучали, например, запрос какая доля молодых людей уходит из родительской семьи в возрасте 16 лет, 17 лет, 18, 19 и так далее. Каждый раз мы получаем из базы ответ, и получается одна из точек на этих диаграммах. Мы можем задавать вопрос о том, какова доля, то, что называется, сингл людей, живущих без супруга, и база будет давать на каждую перепись, мы говорим, найти всех вне семьи живущих на перепись 51 года, 61, 71 и так далее, 11 года, вот эти 6 переписей, мы по каждой переписи, по каждому вопросу получаем ответ из базы, который выглядит так, там 3,5 миллиона семей были расширены на общее количество семей, получаем процент. Но вот теперь, поскольку данные привязаны к приходам, то мы можем строить вот эти диаграммы, чтобы увидеть, какая доля приходов, в каком количестве приходов, какой процент расширенных семей. И вот это только верхушка айсберга. Таких вопросов о том, как менялась семья в Англии за эти 60 лет, можно задавать. И профессор Шурер показал нам наиболее важное измерение семьи. Вот. И этот процесс внимания к семье, он начался в 60-х годах в Англии, когда в Кембридже возникла эта группа при университете, которая изучала изменения демографии Англии. Этот интерес породил мощный, цена такого проекта, скажем, 10 миллионов фунтов, миллиард рублей, скажем. Но там наука вот так поддерживается. И на эти большие гранты можно было ввести эти 100 миллионов первичных сведений о каждом человеке. Ну, у нас, например, эти проблемы, потому что, как все, наверное, знают, первая перепись всероссийская была в 1897. И 10 лет примерно, 5-10 лет готовились 52 тома материалов этой переписи, они были опубликованы в разрезе уездов и губерний. После чего закупили в Америке машину, которая рубит бумагу. Вот туда запустили все 170 миллионов, когда было 65 миллионов первичных листов, пока еще есть. Вот они ими не пользуются здесь. А у нас мы запустили в эту машину коробки бумаги, и все первичные данные исчезли. Да, они опубликованы в виде вот этих агрегированных данных, суммированных по губерниям. Но для историка, конечно, гораздо больше интереса представляют первичные данные, где можно вот все детали изучить, в каком возрасте, какая доля, чего, как. В этом случае советские переписи тоже закончились этим же. Машина коробки бумаги была запущена, и у нас нет первичных данных, к сожалению. Но вот. Некоторые, как выяснилось в последние годы, некоторые, наверное, губернаторы, на каком уровне, я не знаю, но наши историки вдруг обнаруживают около миллиона первичных листов в Тобольске. Он когда был центром губернии, да, обнаружили несколько сот тысяч первичных переписных листов, почему-то их решили спрятать в каком-то углу областного архива, их недавно открыли. Ну, по крайней мере, сообщения об этом не было. А здесь вот на основе первичных данных удалось видеть такую развернуть целую панораму динамики семьи в Англии. Но вот этот интерес, он беспрецедентный для нас. В силу хотя бы того, что Первая мировая война, Вторая мировая война, неоднократный голод, там, 21 года, 33 года, они настолько изменили структуру населения, Ну вот интерес к семье, он ушел на фон. В других странах еще продолжался интерес там, к истории промышленности, истории там, политических партий и так далее. Это все важно. Но семья обычно оставалась как вне фокуса внимания историка. В Англии это уже длится лет 60. Такой семье, это ведь, собственно говоря, основная часть жизни в семье. И неудивительно, что такое внимание стало уделяться семье, особенно когда стало возможным микроданные на уровне персоналей вводить в базы данных, и только тогда появилась возможность не на каких-то маленьких выборках с непонятной репрезентативностью, а на все материальное население вот ставить такие вопросы. Вот так видится значение. А теперь, please, do you have any questions? Don't hesitate to ask. I got the first question. When we look at the distribution of extended families at your diagrams, what is the source to get these extended sources? In the Russian case, these parish books normally don't contain information about structured family. What about England? What is the source to calculate the proportion of extended families?
It's the source that we started with, as mentioned. So here, if we
So records in your parish books
so
contain.
if we look here,
The Julia Freilich, for instance.
so essentially what we have here is a list. So this is the census enumeration document, and you see these numbers here. So this is every new household. So here we have a household, here we have a household, here we have one person living on their own, here we have a big household at the end, here we have another household.
And the name of parish.
Yeah, so here, this is relationship to head of household. Yeah? And if I take my glasses off, I might be able to see better. If we take this household here, here we have head, wife, daughter, daughter, son, daughter, son. So this household has an extended kin. We have somebody other than the parents and the children living with them. So here, this is an extended household.
So when you enter this data, you have a special field, is it extended or not?
Well, we calculate that with an algorithm. This is the raw data, this is what's entered in. Okay, so we need to think about the stages. So this is what's typed into the computer, literally a virtual copy of that. What we then have to do is to convert field into a coded standardized. Okay? So all the variants of spelling, so even on here, so here you can see here we have daughter, and here we have DAU. That's the same thing, so that needs to be coded together. So first of all, we have to code this. There's another complication here. So here we have DO, which basically is deleted from above. So essentially we have to convert this into a codified version. Okay? Then also have marital status, so we know the marital status of the individuals. So then what we have to do is to write what is quite a column that works out who is living with whom. So just because there is a mother here doesn't necessarily make it a extended family. Because if this person was unmarried, that is essentially just simply a mother, that would be a lone parent family. So you have to look at the combination of all of the work out the family structure. There is no direct variable on the census that tells you what the family structure is. You have to work it out algorithmically from the combination of all of the age, sex, marital status and relationships. The computer algorithm that does that is about 20,000 lines of code. Right.
Мы видим здесь результат переписи в одном из касающихся, стоит столбец, который нумерует эти семьи. И по характеру этих записей программа компьютерная сама находит, это расширенная семья или нет, смотря на то, что там есть, например, указание, это мать в этом семействе, один из членов семьи указан как не семья, это показывает, что семья расширенная, там живет кто-то, кто ровен и ребенком, значит он член семьи расширенного типа. И вот представляете себе, вот эти все записи, вручную сделанные, они все заносятся в компьютер, в базу, вот при таком рукописном варианте. Потому что на сегодняшние программы, которые распознают рукописный текст, ну, конечно, когда речь идет о сотнях миллионов, о сотнях миллионов записей, это нереально распознавать машинным образом эти ручные записи. Поэтому те, кто в рамках проекта вводил эти записи, тратили довольно много времени, а потом уже компьютерная программа умная, она с помощью своего алгоритма семьи по составу этих родственных связей. И в результате она добавляет сюда, в эти колонки, вводит новую колонку тип семьи, сингл или standard и так далее. Вот таким образом, да, ну и здесь, конечно, указан, в каком приходе эти люди живут. Отсюда появляется, то есть, положение, что данное о приходе брались из приходских книг, оно здесь не сработает. Источник здесь унифицированный, один, это первичные материалы переписи населения. Вот. И здесь, кстати, наш профессор нашел свою семью, как он уже сказал, вот она на этой странице тоже содержится, его прапрадед здесь. Вот. И после того, как эти данные были введены, он, конечно, не просматривал вручную вот эти листы, но после того, как это все было введено в компьютер, уже дальше найти свою фамилию можно и таким образом восстановить заодно и историю своей семьи.
So I just want to illustrate the point. So you cannot just take this, this is relationships. So here we have several daughters. So here is a daughter, 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 daughter. And here we have a daughter. But this is a very different type of daughter from these daughters. Because this daughter, she's the daughter of the head, but look above her. Here, it says son-in-law. Here he's married. So we can work out that this person is actually the spouse of this person. So she's not just a daughter, she's also a married woman who is living with their husband.
Видите, здесь еще такие нюансы, что там дочь, но она замужем, а там указан муж ее дочери. И это показывает, что это уже стендинг, потому что тут уже родственники выявляются. Там одно дело дочь, а тут дочь замужняя, она живет в том
So this is not about just tabulating this field. You have to look at this in the context of everybody else within the household to understand how to interpret that position. So even if you take heads, this is a head who is married and living with his wife. This is a head who is not living with their wife. And I think there's another one here somewhere. There's also somebody who is married, but they are still not living with their wife. They are living apart from their wife. So you have to treat all of these things separately because you have to analyze the household, not an individual. Which is why, from a computing point of view, it's actually a fairly complex set of work. It's not about making simple cross-sectional tabulations.
Okay. One more question, maybe the last one. Who were people dated? Who were these persons involved in creating this very big database?
The people who initially typed this was a private company called Find My Past, who sell the data to professional family historians and genealogists. But what they type is the raw data, and that's of very little use to historians, because if you take occupation here, you'll see occupation is a textual field. It's written in various different ways. All sorts of occupations are described, even the same occupation may be described in different ways. In order to make this usable for history, you have to codify this. So there are two processes. One is the data capture, which was done commercially. The second is then making sense of it from a historical perspective, which is what I did with people both in Essex and in Leicester.
Как создавалась компьютерная версия этих больших данных? Ответ был такой, как вы поняли, что коммерческие компании, которые получали через грант, они делали так, они вводили это все. Второй этап был работа историков, и когда это выбрался на университете Эссекс, второй этап был содержательное наполнение этих данных с помощью таких наблюдений, которые мы сейчас видели. То есть надо было создаваться алгоритмы вместе с программистами, которые улавливали бы вот эти тонкости состава семьи. Вот. И это большая работа. Show us Schulen. With some comment, what is the definition of your great-grandfather family?
He's born in Germany. He was actually, again, this is misleading because this is 1861. In 1861, there's no such place as Germany.
Yeah, but what's the composition of
He's a